first, as you know, the name of exam is management accounting. You have cleared the financial accounting exam. Now you have to study about management accounting. So first,
Okay.
let me tell you about the exam pattern, that how the exam is tested. So the exam pattern is same as it was in F3. There will be
Okay.
35 objective type questions. By objective type questions, I mean that they can test you multiple choice questions. They can ask you about true or false. They can ask you to to drag the option and put it into the right spot, or they can ask you to type the answers. To type the answers mean that for
Yeah.
example, there is a
Okay.
question, they will ask you to calculate something, and you have to write down the numbers, not the words. Just you need to type the numbers in the empty box. Okay. So
Yeah.
35 questions will be tested like these, and each question is worth 2 marks. So your
Okay.
section A of exam will be of 70 marks. In section B, there will
Okay.
be three questions, three scenario based questions. They will give you a scenario, and relating to these scenarios, there will be further questions, and each MTQ is worth 10 marks. So there will be three MTQs, each MTQ is 10 marks, so three will be of 30 marks. In this way, your paper will be of total 100 marks. Passing percentage of all the ACCA exam is 50%. Okay.
Okay.
Now the
Yeah.
F2 examiner have told you that from where he will test these three MTQs. Okay, these three MTQs, the examiner has already told you that I will be testing these three MTQs from following areas. So let's see those areas from where these three MTQs will be tested. So
Okay.
this is the course in front of you. There are 17 chapters. So the first MTQ, the first MTQ that is of 10 marks, it will be tested from your performance measurement chapter. Okay.
Okay.
So you know that 10 marks question will be tested from this chapter number 16, the first MTQ. The second
Okay.
MTQ, the examiner will be testing from the standard costing area. So these two chapters, they carry 20 marks. 20 marks are very significant. If we see all the chapters out of 17 chapters, these two chapters carry 20 marks. Okay. So first
Okay.
MTQ from performance measurement, second MTQ from standard costing. The third MTQ, the examiner will be testing from either the budgeting or the capital budgeting chapter. Out of these two chapters, he can test you from anywhere. Okay. The third MTQ.
Okay.
He can give 10 marks question from only budgeting chapter, or he can give 10 marks question from only capital budgeting, or he can combine both capital budgeting and budgeting and then give you that 10 marks question. Okay. So it completely depends upon the examiner how he will be testing that third MTQ. So
Okay.
these four chapters, they will be tested in your section B, and your section B is worth 30 marks. So you have to you have idea that how much significant, how much important these four chapters are from exam point of view. Okay.
Yeah.
Uh,
Okay.
Now the F2 course, I divide the F2 course in two areas. Number one, major area. Number two, minor areas. From major areas, I
Okay.
mean that around 90% of your exam, around 90% of your exam will be tested from major areas, and around 10% of your exam will be tested from minor areas. So major areas,
Okay.
they are worth more your effort. You need to put more effort in major areas. While as far minor areas are concerned, you just need to go through them. That's it. You don't need to put much effort on those minor areas. Okay. So I will
Okay.
tell you what the minor areas are, and the rest of them will be major areas. Okay. The chapter one, accounting for management, it is your minor area. The
Okay.
chapter number three, presenting information, it's your minor area. Then
Okay.
the process costing part is also your minor area. Now process costing, when we will study, you will see that the process costing is very lengthy. But from exam point of view, it is very insignificant. The exam is not tested from this part. You will hardly get one MCQ from this part. That's it. Not more than that. And
Okay.
your service and operation costing chapter, it is also a minor area. And lastly, the spreadsheet, it's also a minor area. Okay. The spreadsheet, he will just ask you the question regarding the previous chapters just in form of Excel. That's it. He will ask you the answers in form of, he will tell you what is the answer. You need to tell what are the cells that you need to sum, or that you need to divide, or that you need to deduct to get the answer. So you need to give the answer in form of cells. So spreadsheet is also a minor area, okay? So these 5 areas out of 17 chapters, I have told you these are minor areas. Chapter 1, Chapter 3, process costing in Chapter 9, Chapter 10, service and operation costing, and spreadsheet. So rest of all the rest chapters, they are very important from exam point of view. You need to have good grips on all of the concepts of these chapters, okay? Because they will play an important role in how you are gonna attempt exam, okay? Now
Okay.
these last few chapters, chapter 12, chapter 13, chapter 14, chapter 15, and chapter 16, these 5 chapters are core areas from F2 exam point of view, okay? Now, I have already
Okay.
told you that out of these 4 chapters, chapter 13, 14, 15, and 16, it is guaranteed that you will get 30 marks section B from these areas. Plus, you can get 5 or 6 or maybe 6 or 7 MCQs from these areas. Now, each MCQ is worth 2 marks. So, if you get 7 MCQs from these last 5 chapters, so it means 14 marks from section A and 30
Mm.
marks from section B. So in total, 44 marks of your exam, around, it's approximately 42, 44, 46. These marks of your exam will be tested from these last 5 chapters. So these last
Okay.
5 chapters are very important from exam point of view. Okay.
Okay.
The alternative costing principle is also a minor area. It is not tested in F2. This will be tested in very detailed in your advanced level subject of management, that is performance management F5. Okay. So
Okay.
this is the course overview. I have told you what areas are important and which areas, are less important. Anyways, we have to do everything. So now
Okay.
we will start from the first major area, chapter 2. We will start from, oh sorry, chapter 4, cost classification. Then we will follow the sequence, and the chapter 2 we will do it in the last. Okay, chapter 2 we will do it at the end with chapter number 12, forecasting techniques. The rest we will follow the sequence as it is mentioned here. Okay.
Okay.
So let's start with the first chapter, cost classification. Now the word cost is a very commonly used word. Cost basically means expenditure. For example, if I buy a book from someone for $50, so I will say that $50 is my cost. So expenditure that is required to create a product or to sell a product is known as cost. Cost classification is very necessary. We need to classify the cost into different groups. The purpose of classification is that, we can understand the nature of the cost. We can understand the characteristics of the cost, and we can understand that where we need to reduce the cost, where in the organization the cost is incurring more. So we need to control that part. Okay. So that is the reason
Yeah.
we classify the cost. So
Okay.
before starting the classification, before starting grouping of cost, you need to get familiar with the two terminologies that will be used in the chapter. Number one is cost center. Number two is cost units. Now, what do you mean by
Mm.
cost center? A cost center
I,
is a production or service location. A cost center can be any location. For example, a department in the company, production department, sales department, or it can be a function of an organization. For example, if there is a construction company, then there is a marketing function, then there is a survey function. So it can be a function or item of equipment. It can be an equipment, for example, a machine in an organization for which cost can be ascertained, for which you can separately discover, for which you can separately determine that these are the costs associated with it. Such a thing, it's known as cost center. Okay. For example,
Okay.
in your organization, there is a department. Now, if you know that these costs are related to this department, then we will say that this department is a cost center. For example, if there is a machine, and if you know following are the cost incurred in respect to the machine, if you can determine those costs, then you can say that that machine is also your cost center. For example, if there is a project, if company is investing in a project and company can discover that following are the costs that I am incurring in respect of this project, then that project is also your cost center. Okay.
Okay.
So are you
If
clear with?
something is identifiable, then that is a cost center. Am I right?
Yes, if you can identify cost on something, then that
Okay.
thing is known as cost center.
Okay.
Now, the second thing is cost unit. As you know, we measure everything in units, like we measure distance in kilometers, weight in kgs. Similarly, we measure cost in units. Okay. So that thing
Okay.
is known as cost unit. For example, if you run a hotel, for you, the cost unit can be a room. You can see what is the cost per room. If you are an education provider, for you, cost unit can be a course. For example, you can check what is the cost per course. If you are running a school, then you can take a class as a cost unit. You can see what is the cost per class, or even you can see what is the cost per student. So cost unit, it varies from organization to organization, and it can be different. Okay. It is not
Okay.
necessary that every organization will have same cost unit. No, you can have variety of cost units for various organization. If you are a paint manufacturer, then you can take 1 liter of paint cost per liter as your cost unit. If your organization is, if you are a health provider, if it's a hospital, the hospital can take cost per patient. Okay. So these are
Okay.
known as cost units. Cost unit varies from organization to organization, and in one organization there can be different cost units. Clear?
Okay. Okay. Clear.
Okay. Now we will classify the cost on the basis of four things. There are four ways, there are four criterias on the basis of which cost is classified. Number one is classification by element. Number two is classification by nature. Number three is classification by function. And number four is classification by behavior. Now we will study one by one each of these. The first one is classification by element. Now, by element, cost is of three types. Number one, material cost. Number two, labor cost. Number three, expenses. Now, what is material cost? All cost that you incur in purchasing materials for production or non-production activities. It means that all the costs that you incurred in respect of material. For example, you have purchased some materials, you have purchased some components, you have purchased some parts, you have purchased stationaries. So all the cost that you incur in respect of material, that cost is known as material cost. Clear?
Okay. Okay.
The second one is labor cost. All the staff that are working in your organization, all the employees that are working in your organization, their cost is known as labor cost. Okay. The staff
Okay.
cost, the employee's cost is known as labor cost. The common example of labor cost is salary. You give salary to your employees. So for you, the salary is cost. You give bonus to your employees. So for you, the bonus is cost. You give sick pay to employees. You give other benefits to employees. So these are costs from your point of view. So all the cost that you incur in relation to your staff or your employees in an organization, they are known as that cost is known as labor cost. Okay. Now the third thing is
Okay.
expenses. Expenses is a default category. Expenses is a default category. By default, I mean that if you cannot classify the cost into material or labor, you will say that this cost is an expense. So cost which are not material, which you cannot classify into material, cost which you cannot classify into labor, they will automatically be, they will be by default your expenses. For example, rent. Now, cost of rent, you cannot say that rent is a material cost, right? You cannot say that. Similarly,
Yeah.
you cannot say that rent is a labor cost. You cannot say that because it's not in relation to your employees. So, such cost which you can't classify in material, which you can't classify in labor, they will be by default known as your expenses. Clear?
Okay. Yeah, clear.
Okay. So this is the first classification, classification by element. By element, cost is of three types: material cost, labor cost, and expenses. Now we'll move onwards. The second basis of classification is by nature. Now, by nature, cost is of two types. Number one, direct cost. Number two, indirect cost. Now, what is direct cost? Direct cost is a cost that you can directly identify, trace, attribute, relate to a finished unit or a cost center. It is known as your direct cost. Okay. So, for example, if you see a product and if you can classify the cost directly in relation to that product, you will say that this cost is a direct cost. Okay. Now,
Okay.
direct cost is of three types: direct material cost, direct labor cost, direct expenses. Now, let me give you an example so you can understand it better. Now, for example, you go to a market and you see a shirt. Okay, you go to a market, you go to a shop and you see a shirt. Now, what is the shirt made up of? What is the shirt made up of?
It's, it's a piece of cloth.
Yes, cloth, right. And what is cloth? It is a material, right? Cloth is
Yeah.
a material. And when you will see that cloth, you can directly, when you will see that shirt, you can directly identify that it is made up of a cloth, right? You can directly identify it. So that cloth will be known as your direct material because it is a material that you can directly identify. Cle-
Okay.
Clear?
Yeah, clear.
Now, for example, there is a wooden chair. There's a wooden chair or wooden door, wooden furniture in your house. Now, what is the wooden chair made up of?
It's made up of wood.
Yes. And what is wood? Wood is a material.
It's a direct material.
Yes. And because you can directly trace it, you can directly identify it, then you will say that it is a direct
Direct.
material. So this is direct material cost. Clear?
Okay.
Now the second one is direct labor cost. Now in organization, there are two types of labor. Number one is known as direct labor or direct worker. They both means the same thing, direct. And number two is indirect. Now, what are the direct workers? That
But I
that are
can.
what are you saying?
Okay. Yeah, yeah, you continue.
Okay, let me write it down here. We will talk about indirect when we will talk about indirect cost. Now, labor are of two types. Number one is direct labor. Number two is indirect labor. Now, what is direct labor? Labor that is involved directly in production. Okay, the labor that is involved directly in production, or if you are a service organization, the labor that is involved directly in providing that service is known as direct labor. Okay, and the
Okay.
cost of that labor will be known as direct labor cost. Did you get this
Okay.
point?
Yeah.
The direct labor is a person, direct labor or a worker is a person that is directly doing the production. Or if you are a service organization, that person will be directly providing the service. So cost of that labor will be known as direct labor cost. So simply,
Yeah.
the cost of direct labor will be known as your direct labor cost. For example, the shirt, the shirt is manufactured by, is prepared by a tailor, right? Now,
Yeah.
tailor, he will be your what? He will be your direct labor
Direct
because he
labor.
is directly making the product. The example of chair that I gave you. Now, chair is made by carpenter A carpenter
Okay.
will be your direct labor. For example, you are providing service, you are providing auditing service. So the person that is doing the audit, that will be your direct labor. If you are
Yeah.
providing any other consultancy service, the person that is directly involved in providing the service, it's known as direct labor. You are a transport company, you run buses. Now who is directly providing the service? The driver. The driver is doing the work. Okay, so that driver, he will be your direct labor. So in this way you have to classify the direct labor cost. You need to see which worker or which labor is direct one, and the cost of that direct labor will be known as direct labor cost.
Okay.
Clear?
Yeah, clear.
Okay. Now the third thing is direct expenses. Okay. Now first thing you need to remember that first you need to identify whether that cost is a material cost, a labor cost, or an expense. Then afterwards you need to see whether it is a direct or it's indirect. Now what is direct expense? Direct expense, the main indication of direct expense is that you need to see whether that expense is incurred specific for a purpose. If that expense is incurred specific for a one purpose, you will say that expense is a direct expense. Okay. For example, you you hire tools. Okay, for example, you are an electrician and you need to do some work. You got a work and you don't have equipments to do that work, so you hire the tools. Okay, hire the tools to do that job. For example, the job is job 1 2 3, any job you need to do a job, and for the purpose of a job you need tools, and you hire those tools. Now what is hiring cost? Is it material cost, labor, or expense?
It's, it's expense.
Yes, the reason is, hire means it's like rent. You are renting out something, right? So
Yeah.
hire, you cannot say that hire is a material cost. You cannot say that a hire is a labor cost. So it will be automatically called expense. It's by default expense. Now
Yeah,
because
similar to rent.
Yes. Now, because you are incurring that expense specifically for this purpose, specifically for doing this job, so this expense will be known as your direct expense. Okay. So
Okay.
if you are incurring an expense specific to a purpose, then that expense will be known as your direct expense. Clear?
Okay. Okay, clear.
Okay. Now let's move on to the indirect cost. It is exactly the opposite to the direct cost, mirror image rule. Direct cost was one that can be directly classified, that can be directly attributed to a finished unit. Indirect cost is opposite. Look, all the costs that you are incurring, they are part of the production process, right? But we are differentiating them on the basis of whether they are directly attributable or they are indirectly attributable. Okay, so that is the reason
Okay.
we are differentiating them. So indirect cost, just like direct cost, is of three types: indirect material, indirect labor, and indirect expenses. Now material, I told you the direct material you can directly trace that material, but indirect material you cannot directly trace the indirect material. Okay, let me give you an example. Now we talked about the shirt. Now the shirt is made from sewing machine.
Yeah.
For example, for the cleaning of sewing machine, you use cleaning material, some cleaning material. Maybe it can be oil, fluid, so you can clean that machine so that machine could work efficiently, smoothly. So you use some cleaning material to clean out that sewing machine. Now, can while seeing the finished product, while seeing the shirt in a market, can you identify that there will be a cost of cleaning material that was incurred on this shirt? Can you directly identify it?
No,
No, you
I
cannot
can't see.
directly. Yes, you cannot tell. You
Yeah.
cannot tell by watching, by seeing that shirt. You know that in the process of this shirt, there must be a usage of cleaning material. You cannot say that, right? You cannot identify that. So such
Yeah.
material, it is known as indirect material. Indirect material, it is the part of the process, but you cannot directly identify it while watching that finished product. Okay. So this is how
Okay.
you classify indirect material and direct material. Mostly in
Okay.
exam, in kit questions or in exam, he will give you an example of cleaning material with respect to indirect material. Okay, he will give you example of cleaning material, because cleaning materials are the one that are indirect material. Rest of the materials that are used in making the product, they will be identifiable. So the cleaning material is the one that will be indirect one. Okay. Now,
Okay.
indirect labor. Direct labor, I told you that the labor that was involved in the production is known as direct labor. Indirect labor is the labor that provide assistance to direct workers. So it means that any labor except for direct labor, it will be known as indirect labor. Okay. Direct labor is the labor that is directly involved in the production. All of the other workers except the direct labor, they will be known as indirect labor. For example, in a factory, the tailors, they are manufacturing the shirts. Okay. Now there will be a supervisor that will be supervising them, that will be managing them. Now, supervisor, now let me give you an example. There will be a supervisor and you will be paying supervisor a salary. Now, supervisor salary will be what? It will be a labor cost, okay? Because supervisor is a labor and his salary will be a labor cost. Is supervisor directly involved in production?
No.
No. He's just providing assistance to the ones who are involved in production. He's managing them, he's supervising them. So the supervisor will be known as indirect labor. Okay. So this is
Okay.
how you will classify direct cost and indirect labor cost. Okay.
Okay.
Now the last one is an indirect expense. Now, what is indirect expense? Direct expense, I told you that expense that is incurred specific for a one purpose is known as direct expense. Indirect expense is an expense that is the general expense. It is an overall expense. It is not for a specific purpose, okay? It is a general expense. It is an overall expense. Such expenses are known as indirect expense. For example, rent. Now, rent is a general expense, is an overall expense. It will be known as indirect expense. For example, your insurance. Insurance is a general expense. It will be known as indirect expense. Okay. So all the expenses that are
Okay.
general, that are overall expenses, they will be known as indirect expenses. While the expenses that are incurred specific for a purpose, they will be known as direct expense. So clear with this
Okay.
thing?
Yeah, clear.
Okay. Sum of all direct costs is known as prime cost. Direct material plus direct labor plus direct expense. They are sum of these three is known as prime cost, and sum of all indirect costs is known as overheads. Okay. For example, indirect material plus
Okay.
indirect labor plus indirect expense. So from now on onwards, wherever you see the word overheads, so this thing should be in your mind that overheads mean indirect cost. Okay.
Indirect.
And prime cost mean
Okay.
direct cost. Now, let me give you further
Okay.
example to clear out that expenses concept. For example, a company is doing different projects, project 1, project 2, project 3, project 4, and company has hired crane. These are construction projects. So company has hired a crane and crane is working on all these 4 projects. Now, tell me what will be the hiring cost? Will it be a material cost, labor cost, or an expense?
Expense.
Yes. And will it be direct one or will it be indirect one?
It's an indirect one.
Yes. The reason is, it is not for a specific purpose. The crane, it is being
Yeah.
used on different projects. So you will see you will say that it is a general expense, right? Similarly, for example,
Yeah.
company got an opportunity of project 5, and specifically for that project, a company subcontracted a crane. A company hired another crane. So now, if you hire a crane and you are using the crane just on this project, project 5. So you will say that this hiring cost, it will be direct expense, because now this expense is incurred
Okay.
specifically for just this project. Okay.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
in this way, you have to classify direct expenses and indirect expenses.
Expenses. Okay.
So this was your
Clear.
classification by nature. Any question?
Yeah, I'm clear.
Okay,
It's
okay,
easy to understand.
okay. Now let's move on to the third basis of classification. It is classification by function. Okay, classification by
Okay.
function. By function, cost is of two types: production cost and non-production cost. Now you don't need to mix this with direct and indirect. Okay, now you just have to see from the perspective that whether it relates to the production, whether it relates to the production process as a whole, or it doesn't relate to the production process as a whole. So in this way, you will classify these two. So by function, cost is of
Okay.
two types: production cost and non-production cost. Now, what is production cost? Cost that relates to the manufacture of product or provision of service. These are part of cost of sales in statement of profit or loss. All the cost that relates to the production are known as production cost. That relates to the manufacture of product are known as production cost. Okay. Now, examples that I have
Okay.
wrote down here are prime cost. Now, what were the prime cost? These were the direct cost, right? And direct cost are
Yeah.
the one that we can directly relate to a product. So the if we can directly relate a cost to the product, it obviously means that this cost will be the part of production, right? So all the direct
Yeah.
cost, all the prime cost, they will be production cost. Okay. Plus
Okay.
production overheads. Overheads mean indirect cost, and indirect costs that are related to production are known as production overheads. Let me give you an example. Now, electricity cost. Can you tell me what the electricity cost is? Is it material? Is it labor? Or is it an expense?
Is it the expense?
Yes. The reason, because you cannot classify it in material, and you cannot
It's
classify in
value.
labor either. Okay. So it's your expense. Now,
Okay.
it is whether it's direct expense or is an indirect expense.
It's an indirect expense, I think so.
Yes, it is an indirect expense. It's a general expense. So it is an indirect expense. Okay. So indirect cost was known as what?
Okay.
Indirect cost was known as overheads. So if a cost is indirect, it means it is
Yeah.
overhead. Clear? Now,
Okay.
now this
Okay.
overhead, now this overhead is related to production, right? Because without electricity, you cannot produce something. Electricity is necessary for the production, right?
Yeah.
So this overhead is related to the
Yeah.
production. So we will say that the electricity cost is a production overhead, and it will be a production cost. Okay, clear?
Okay. Okay.
Okay. So in this way, you
Yeah,
need to
clear.
in this way you need to classify the things. So production overheads means that indirect cost. Overheads mean indirect cost, and production overheads mean indirect cost that are related to production. They will be known as production overheads. Okay. Now let me give you
Okay.
another example. Supervisor salary. Supervisor salary. In the factory, there's a supervisor that is supervising the persons that are manufacturing things. Okay. Now, what will be a supervisor's salary? It will be material, labor, or expense. What will be? What will it be?
The labor.
Direct or indirect?
It is indirect labor.
Yes, indirect. So if a cost is indirect, it means that cost is what? It is an overhead. Now,
Okay.
now this supervisor is supervising, it is he is managing the workers that are in factory doing the production. So he is also related to that production process. He's not producing something,
Yeah.
but he is managing those that are doing production. So he is also related to that process, right? So we will say
Yeah,
that
yeah.
he will all it that supervisor's salary will all also be what? It will also be a production overhead. Okay.
Production.
So in this
Okay.
way, you have to classify the things. So production cost means that the cost that relates to the manufacturing of the product. Okay. These are known as production cost. And examples of production costs are prime cost. Prime cost means all the direct cost and plus the production overheads. Clear?
Nice. Yeah, clear.
Now, the second classification by function is non-production cost. Non-production cost simply means the cost that is not associated with the production process. Okay, that cost will be known as non-production cost. Examples are administration cost. Now, for example, the factory is outside the city. Your main office will be in the city, and you will be incurring some office cost. You will be paying the rent of office. You will be paying wages to the person who are working in office. You will be paying bills of your office. So all these comes under administration cost, and administration cost is a non-production cost. Similarly, selling cost.
Mm,
Okay, selling cost means, for example, you are a car
okay.
manufacturer and you are making cars. Now your showroom is in the city in different areas. Okay, now you will be incurring some cost with respect to showroom, like you will be paying rent of showroom, you will be giving wages to the persons in showroom, and you will be
Okay.
paying bills of showroom. So all this comes under selling cost, and selling cost is what? A non-production cost. Similarly, distribution cost. In distribution cost, you know how you distribute the product, the advertisement cost, marketing cost, they all come under distribution cost. Distribution cost involves you are transferring the product from warehouse to the customer. All this process, it is known as
Mm,
distribution. So all the costs associated with this thing, it will be distribution cost. And the last one is the finance cost. Finance cost means that, for example, you have taken a loan from a bank, and against the loan you have to pay the interest, right? And that interest, it will be
yeah.
known as finance cost. And finance cost is also a non production cost.
Mhm. Okay.